The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over Willow Creek Estates, a pristine suburban neighborhood characterized by manicured lawns, pristine white picket fences, and houses so identical they could have been plucked straight from a catalog. The air smelled faintly of blooming hydrangeas, a staple in nearly every front yard. Birds chirped a harmonious melody, as if to announce the arrival of the newest residents Marcus and Deja Jackson. The couple's black SUV rumbled into the driveway of their newly purchased home, a charming two-story craftsman with light blue siding and a wraparound porch. Deja leaned out of the window, her dark curls bouncing as she surveyed the house with a smile that stretched wide across her face. "Our dream house," she said softly, almost in disbelief. Marcus chuckled from the driver's seat, his deep voice warm and reassuring. "You've been saying that since the open house, babe. We're finally here." He turned off the ignition, stepped out of the car, and stretched, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered frame. Marcus was a man who carried himself with quiet confidence, his presence both commanding and approachable. Deja joined him on the driveway, her hands slipping naturally into his. She was shorter, her bright eyes scanning the neighborhood. The couple's love was palpable, evident in the small, tender gestures they exchanged without a second thought. They had worked tirelessly for this moment, years of hard work in law enforcement, countless hours of overtime, and the strain of balancing dangerous careers with their personal lives. This house was more than just a home, it was a symbol of everything they'd achieved together. As they stood there, taking in their new surroundings, Marcus and Deja noticed something unsettling, a curtain twitching in the window of the house, across the street. A woman, barely concealed behind the fabric, was peering out at them. Her expression, though fleeting, was unmistakable curiosity tinged with apprehension. Deja squeezed Marcus's hand. "Guess the neighbors are already checking us out," she said, her voice laced with humor but undercut by a hint of unease. Marcus shrugged, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Let them look. We're not here to blend in, we're here to live." He kissed the top of her head before moving to the back of the SUV to unload their belongings. Inside the house, the scent of fresh paint lingered, mingling with the faint odor of sawdust from recent renovations. Sunlight streamed through the oversized windows, highlighting the polished hardwood floors and crown molding. Deja wandered through the space, running her fingers over the smooth banister of the staircase. This was their sanctuary, the reward for years of relentless pursuit of justice and countless nights spent comforting each other after harrowing cases. The couple spent the next few hours unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. Deja meticulously unpacked their wedding china, carefully placing each piece in the glass-fronted cabinet in the dining room. Marcus focused on setting up their entertainment system, muttering under his breath as he wrestled with tangled cords. As the day wore on, they took a break on the porch, sipping iced tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt more oppressive than peaceful. Occasionally, a car would drive by, its occupants sneaking glances at the couple, as though they were a spectacle to be studied. Deja broke the silence. "I know it's just the first day, but do you think it's, I don't know, weird how no one's come to introduce themselves?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "We're the new folks in town. Sometimes people need time to warm up." "Yeah, but usually people at least wave," Deja countered. She pointed toward the house across the street. "That lady has been watching us all day. Not even a smile." Marcus followed her gaze and spotted the same twitching curtain. "She probably just doesn't know how to mind her own business," he said with a chuckle, though there was a hardness in his tone that Deja didn't miss. The next morning, Marcus and Deja decided to explore the neighborhood. They walked hand in hand, their easy banter filling the space between them. Deja wore a flowing sundress, her skin glowing in the morning sunlight, while Marcus opted for a simple t-shirt and jeans. They passed a group of children riding bikes and playing tag on the sidewalk. The kids froze as the couple approached, their laughter fading into a tense silence. "Hi there," Deja said, her voice warm and inviting. She gave a small wave, but the children stared at her blankly before quickly scattering, their bikes clattering against the pavement as they pedaled away. Deja's smile faltered. "Okay, that was weird." Marcus sighed. "They're just kids. Probably not used to seeing new faces around here." As they continued their walk, they noticed similar reactions from adults. A jogger crossed to the other side of the street. A man watering his lawn suddenly found something fascinating about his hedges. The couple exchanged a knowing look but said nothing, unwilling to let the cold reception dampen their spirits. When they returned home, they found a folded note tucked into their mailbox. Deja opened it, her brow furrowing as she read aloud, "Welcome to Willow Creek. HOA rules are attached. Please review them carefully." Marcus snorted. "Not exactly a warm welcome, huh?" "Yeah, no signature," Deja added, holding up the note. "Just the rules. Guess they really want us to know where we stand." Later that day, Marcus decided to tackle the overgrown backyard while Deja started on the front garden. She knelt in the soil, planting a row of begonias, when a figure approached from the sidewalk. It was an older man, dressed in khakis and a golf shirt, his graying hair neatly combed. "Hello there," he said, his tone neutral. "I'm Bob. I live 3 houses down." Deja stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Hi, Bob. I'm Deja. Nice to meet you." Bob glanced toward the backyard, where Marcus was trimming hedges with a pair of shears. His eyes lingered for a moment before returning to Deja. "Why, all settling in okay?" "Yes, we're getting there," Deja replied, forcing a smile. "It's a lovely neighborhood." Bob nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Well, if you need anything, I guess you know where to find me." Deja watched as he walked away, her smile fading as soon as his back was turned. She couldn't shake the feeling that his visit wasn't about welcoming them at all, but rather about sizing them up. That night, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Marcus and Deja discussed the day's events. "It's like they've never seen black people before," Deja said, her frustration evident. "Maybe they haven't," Marcus replied bluntly. "But they're going to have to get used to it." Deja leaned her head on his shoulder, finding comfort in his steady presence. "Do you think we made a mistake moving here?" "No," Marcus said firmly. "We earned this. We belong here just as much as anyone else." As they turned off the lights and headed upstairs, the faint glow of a cell phone screen illuminated the window across the street. Helen, the nosy neighbor, was busy typing furiously into a neighborhood group chat. Her message was simple but ominous. "Does anyone else think there's something off about the new couple?" Unaware of Helen's schemes, Marcus and Deja drifted off to sleep, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in their new neighborhood. Helen Whitman was the self-appointed eyes and ears of Willow Creek Estates, though no one had officially asked her to be. From her pristine colonial-style home, with its red shutters and perfectly trimmed hedges, she watched everything and everyone. A long-time resident in her late 50s, Helen prided herself on maintaining what she called the integrity of the neighborhood. It was a thinly veiled code for keeping things just as they had always been: white, conservative, and predictably uniform. She sat at her kitchen table that evening, a steaming mug of herbal tea in one hand and her phone in the other. A newly created group chat titled Willow Creek Safety Watch buzzed with activity, her initial message stirring up a flurry of responses. Helen had started it innocuously enough: new neighbors across the street. Anyone know their story? But as the responses trickled in, her questions became pointed. "I saw the man unloading a lot of equipment. Does anyone know what they do for work? They're young to afford a place like that. Do we think they're long-term?" Her close friend, Pam, chimed in with enthusiasm. "Helen, you're probably right to keep an eye on them. I've seen some unfamiliar cars around their house. Could be trouble." "It's not just the cars," Helen typed quickly. "It's the attitude. They haven't introduced themselves properly, and the woman barely acknowledged me this afternoon." In truth, Deja had smiled and waved earlier that day while gardening, but Helen had chosen to see it as dismissive. To her, friendliness had to come on her terms. Another neighbor, Tom, entered the chat. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe they're just private people. Or maybe they're hiding something," Pam countered. "Helen's instincts are usually right." Helen smirked at the validation. Her instincts were honed from years of imagining the worst about anyone who didn't fit her carefully curated image of Willow Creek. To her, Marcus and Deja didn't fit. Not because of their demeanor, they had been nothing but polite, but because their presence disrupted the narrative she had built in her mind about what her neighborhood was supposed to be. She leaned back in her chair, mulling over her next move. A part of her wondered if she was being unfair, but the deeper, more instinctual part of her, the part shaped by fear and prejudice, won out. She opened another app on her phone and dialed a non-emergency line. Across the street, Marcus and Deja had no idea that their evening would be interrupted. They were in the middle of unpacking a box labeled books when they heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel. Marcus looked up from his task, his instincts kicking in as he peeked through the front window. A police cruiser idled at the curb. Two officers stepped out, their radios crackling as they scanned the area. Marcus and Deja exchanged a look, the kind that spoke volumes without words. "Stay calm," Marcus murmured, his tone low but steady. They had been here before, not in this exact scenario, but close enough to know how these situations could escalate. A knock at the door broke the silence. Deja inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders, and opened it. "Good evening, officers," she said evenly, masking her unease. "Can I help you?" One officer, a tall man with a closely shaved head, nodded curtly. "We got a call from a neighbor about some suspicious activity at this address." Deja's brow furrowed. "Suspicious activity? We're just moving in." "Mind if we take a look around?" the second officer asked, his tone less aggressive but no less invasive. Marcus stepped forward, his presence instantly commanding. "Is there a specific complaint, or is this just a random check?" His deep voice was calm but firm, his years of law enforcement training evident in his demeanor. The officers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering under Marcus's steady gaze. The taller one finally spoke. "Just following up on a call." "Well," Marcus said, stepping aside, "you're welcome to look, but I can assure you there's nothing suspicious here." The officers entered, their eyes sweeping the room. It was a typical moving scene: half-empty boxes, folded packing materials, and a couple still settling into their new home. Nothing about it warranted a police presence. As the officers moved to leave, Deja couldn't hold back. "Who called this in?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. She already knew the answer but wanted it spoken aloud. "Can't say," the shorter officer replied, avoiding her gaze. "Just doing our job." When the door finally closed behind them, Deja turned to Marcus, her jaw tight. "This is what they mean by a welcome wagon, huh?" Marcus pulled her into a reassuring embrace. "Let them play their games. They'll learn soon enough who they're dealing with." Unbeknownst to the couple, Helen had been watching from her window, a smug smile on her face. She felt a surge of satisfaction seeing the police car in front of their house. In her mind, she was protecting her neighborhood. What she didn't know was that her actions had set in motion a series of events that would upend her illusion of control and her prejudices forever. The next few days in Willow Creek passed with an uneasy calm. Marcus and Deja went about their lives, unpacking boxes, setting up their home office, and making the occasional trip to the local hardware store. They maintained their routine as though nothing had happened, but the weight of the encounter with the police lingered in the air like an invisible fog. By the third evening, Deja decided she couldn't stay cooped up any longer. "Let's take a walk," she suggested, slipping on her sneakers. "It'll help clear our heads." Marcus hesitated. "You think that's a good idea? Feels like every move we make is under a microscope." "All the more reason," Deja replied firmly. "We're not going to hide in our own neighborhood." Reluctantly, Marcus agreed. They stepped out into the crisp evening air, walking side by side down the quiet streets. The glow of streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the occasional sound of a dog barking punctuated the silence. As they walked, they passed Helen's house, her silhouette faintly visible through the living room curtains. Deja suppressed the urge to wave, deciding it wasn't worth the effort. The next morning, Marcus was in the backyard trimming a stubborn hedge when Deja's voice called out from the porch. "Babe, there's someone at the door." He wiped his hands on his jeans and joined her. Standing on the porch were two police officers, the same ones who had visited days earlier. Their presence was less hostile this time, but no less unsettling. Marcus exchanged a glance with Deja before addressing them. "Officers, back again, huh?" The taller officer, whose name badge read Officer Daniels, offered a tight-lipped smile. "We're here to follow up on a few reports from the neighborhood watch. People are concerned about unfamiliar cars parked in the area." Deja folded her arms across her chest. "You mean our friends? The ones helping us move?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably, but his partner, Officer Ruiz, stepped forward. attempting a more conciliatory tone. Look, we're just doing our job. It's protocol to check when we get multiple calls. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Understood. But let me ask you something, what exactly did these calls say? Because last I checked, parking in front of your own house isn't a crime. Ruiz hesitated before responding. Nothing specific, just concerns. Concerns, Deja repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. Right. Well, let's clear this up once and for all. She gestured for them to follow and led them into the house. Inside, the couple's home was neat and orderly. Framed degrees adorned one wall, Marcus's in criminal justice and Deja's in behavioral psychology. A small bookshelf displayed awards and plaques, including a Detective of the Year trophy that gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the window. Deja walked over to the mantel and picked up a framed photo, handing it to Daniels. It was a picture of the couple in uniform, standing proudly in front of their precinct. "That's us," she said, her tone sharp. "Detective Deja Jackson, Behavioral Analysis Unit. And that's my husband, Detective Marcus Jackson, Homicide Division." The officers exchanged a stunned glance. Daniels opened his mouth to speak but seemed to falter, while Ruiz cleared his throat awkwardly. We didn't know," he stammered. "Well, now you do," Marcus said firmly. "So unless you have a legitimate reason to be here, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop wasting our time and get back to serving the community." Ruiz nodded quickly. "Of course, Detective Jackson. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." The officers turned to leave, but Deja called out, stopping them in their tracks. "One more thing," she said. "You might want to let the person who keeps calling know that filing false reports is a criminal offense. Wouldn't want them to get in trouble, would we?" The officers nodded stiffly and exited, leaving Marcus and Deja alone in the entryway. For a moment there was silence between them, the tension finally breaking as Deja let out a humorless laugh. "Think that'll shut them up?" she asked, leaning against the wall. Marcus shook his head, his expression grim. "Not a chance. People like that don't stop until they're forced to face the truth." Across the street, Helen watched the scene unfold from her perch at the window. Her jaw tightened as she saw the officers leave, their posture noticeably less confident than when they'd arrived. She'd seen the framed photo Deja had shown them, though she couldn't make out the details. Still, something about the couple's demeanor unsettled her. They weren't just new neighbors, they were something more, something she couldn't quite place. She grabbed her phone and typed furiously into the group chat, "Police just left the Jacksons' house. Something feels off about them. Anyone else notice anything unusual?" Pam was the first to respond. "Saw a moving truck there this morning." "Did they hire movers, or are those more of their friends?" Helen's fingers flew across the screen. "I'll keep watching. We need to get to the bottom of this." That evening, Marcus and Deja decided to address the situation head-on. They drafted a friendly but firm email to the neighborhood association, introducing themselves and offering to meet with anyone who had concerns. Deja was confident that transparency would help, but Marcus remained skeptical. "They don't want to meet us, Deja. They want to make us the problem," he said as he hit send. "But if it makes you feel better, I'll play along." By the next morning, the email had circulated, and the responses trickled in. Most were polite but curt, thanking the couple for their message without committing to any further action. One, however, stood out, a terse reply from Helen herself. "Appreciate the introduction. Let's see how things go." Deja frowned as she read it aloud. "What does that even mean?" "It means she's not done with us," Marcus said, his voice heavy with resignation. Sure enough, later that afternoon, Helen was at it again. She stood outside her house, chatting animatedly with Pam while making a show of glancing over at the Jacksons' driveway. Deja, who had been watering the front garden, caught sight of them and waved, but neither woman responded. Inside, Marcus was on the phone with an old colleague, venting his frustration. "We've been in this house less than a week, and already they're trying to paint us as criminals," he said, pacing the living room. "It's like they can't stand the idea of us being here." His colleague, a seasoned detective named Carter, sighed on the other end. "You want my advice? Keep your heads down and let them dig their own hole. People like that always overplay their hand." Marcus nodded, though the advice did little to ease his anger. "Yeah, maybe. But I'm not about to let them push us out of our own home." Carter chuckled. I wouldn't expect you to. Just remember you're not on duty here. Let them make the first move. As Marcus hung up, Deja walked in, her expression weary. They're out there gossiping again, she said, collapsing onto the couch. I swear, I've never seen people so obsessed with their neighbors. Marcus sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Let them talk. We'll handle it when the time comes. But as the couple settled in for the evening, neither could shake the feeling that the time was coming sooner than they expected. Outside, Helen was already plotting her next move, unaware that her actions would soon backfire in ways she couldn't imagine. The weekend arrived, and Willow Creek Estates was buzzing with its usual quiet activity: parents mowing lawns, kids riding bikes, and Helen orchestrating a neighborhood yard sale. Folding tables filled with knickknacks and old clothes lined the sidewalks, while Helen held court in her driveway, proudly displaying her pristine antiques. As always, she kept one eye on her wares and the other on the Jacksons' house across the street. Marcus and Deja were in their backyard, enjoying a rare day off together. They sipped lemonade under the shade of a sprawling oak tree, trying to ignore the subtle tension that still lingered in the neighborhood. Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching Deja as she thumbed through a gardening magazine. I think we should put in a raised bed over there, she said, pointing toward the far end of the yard. Grow some vegetables next spring. Marcus grinned. You want to add farmer to your resume now? Deja rolled her eyes playfully. Why not? I've got the patience for it, unlike some people I know. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of a car door slamming drew their attention. They exchanged a glance as they heard the low murmur of voices from the front yard. Curious but cautious, Marcus stood and made his way to the side gate, peering around the corner to see what was happening. A police cruiser was parked in front of Helen's house, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Two officers stood on the driveway, speaking with Helen and a small group of neighbors who had gathered around. Helen gestured animatedly, her voice carrying just enough for Marcus to catch fragments of her words. Concerns about safety, strange visitors, keeping the neighborhood secure. Marcus's jaw tightened. He stepped back from the gate, shaking his head in frustration. They're at it again, he said as he returned to Deja. Police, she asked, already knowing the answer. Yep, Helen, spinning her web, Marcus replied, sitting heavily in his chair. Probably making us sound like the neighborhood bogeyman. Deja sighed and set down her magazine. Should we go out there? No, Marcus said firmly. Not yet. Let them come to us if they have something to say. Minutes later, a knock at the door shattered the quiet of their home. Marcus opened it to find Officer Daniels and Officer Ruiz standing on the porch. Daniels looked uncomfortable, while Ruiz seemed almost apologetic. Detectives, Daniels began, his tone hesitant. Sorry to bother you again, but we've had some complaints. Marcus folded his arms, his eyes narrowing. Let me guess. More concerns from the neighborhood watch. Daniels nodded, clearly aware of how thin the pretense was. We're just here to follow up. Can we come in? Marcus stepped aside, his expression grim. Sure, why not? Make yourselves at home. As the officers entered, Deja joined them, her posture calm but her eyes sharp. What exactly are the complaints this time, she asked. Daniels hesitated before answering. Reports of unfamiliar vehicles coming and going, loud noises late at night, and suspicious activity. Deja raised an eyebrow. Suspicious activity? Like what? Ruiz cleared his throat. Honestly, there's nothing specific. It's more about the perception. The perception, Marcus repeated, his voice low and measured. Got it. Deja walked over to a table near the fireplace, picking up a binder. She opened it and removed a set of documents, handing them to Ruiz. Here are our credentials. Again, if anyone's questioning who we are or what we do, feel free to share this with them. Ruiz accepted the papers with a nod. Thank you, Detective Jackson. We'll make sure this is documented. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to Marcus. Look, we don't want to waste your time, but maybe it would help if you address the neighborhood directly. Sometimes a little communication can go a long way. Marcus clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. Let me get this straight. We're the ones being harassed, and your solution is for us to explain ourselves to the people causing the problem. Ruiz raised a placating hand. I understand how this looks. No, Deja interjected, her voice firm but calm. You don't. But I'll tell you what. We'll think about it. In the meantime, I suggest you remind whoever keeps calling you that this kind of behavior borders on harassment. The officers nodded awkwardly before leaving, their discomfort palpable. As the door closed behind them, Marcus let out a long breath and ran a hand over his face. This is ridiculous, he muttered. We're detectives, and we're being treated like suspects. Deja placed a hand on his arm. I know, but remember what Carter said, let them overplay their hand. As the sun set over Willow Creek, Helen sat at her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She was crafting an email to the neighborhood association, filled with vague but ominous warnings about protecting the community. Little did she know, her actions were being monitored more closely than she realized. In the Jacksons' home office, Marcus and Deja sat side by side, reviewing footage from the security cameras they had installed around their property. The cameras captured more than just their own yard. They had also picked up Helen's frequent surveillance, and even recorded her standing at the edge of their driveway, snapping photos with her phone. Deja leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Think it's time to pay Helen a visit. Marcus smirked. Not yet. Let's see how far she's willing to go. For the first time in days, they felt a sense of control returning. While the neighborhood's hostility still loomed, Marcus and Deja knew they had the tools and the experience to turn the tide. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light and Helen's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The morning after the second police visit, Helen woke to find an email waiting in her inbox. The subject line read, Neighborhood Watch Misconduct Official Notice. Her stomach churned as she clicked on it, her smug confidence replaced with a creeping sense of dread. The message was short but firm, sent from the Neighborhood Association's Leadership Committee. It outlined concerns regarding misuse of the community's Neighborhood Watch program and the improper filing of complaints. The email didn't name names, but the implication was clear. Helen's actions were drawing unwanted attention, and the HOAA wasn't pleased. Fuming, Helen slammed her laptop shut. She couldn't fathom how her efforts to protect the neighborhood had backfired. They should be thanking me, she thought bitterly, pacing the kitchen. To her, the problem wasn't her behavior, it was the Jacksons. Meanwhile, across the street, Marcus and Deja were preparing for what Deja had jokingly referred to as their press conference. They had decided to take Officer Daniels' advice and meet with the neighbors face to face. Not to explain themselves, but to set the record straight. Marcus straightened his tie, glancing at his reflection in the mirror. You sure about this? He asked, turning to Deja. She adjusted her blazer and gave him a confident smile. It's better than letting them keep spinning their lies. If we don't speak up, they'll keep filling the silence with their own narrative. He nodded, taking her hand. Let's do this. The neighborhood meeting was held on a bright Saturday afternoon in the local park, under the shade of a large pavilion. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a small podium stood at the front. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of curiosity, tension, and unease. Many residents had heard whispers about the Jacksons' professions, but this was their first chance to hear directly from the couple. Helen arrived early, her expression tight as she took a seat in the front row. Pam and Tom sat on either side of her, whispering nervously. Helen scanned the crowd, noticing the diversity of reactions. Some neighbors appeared genuinely curious, while others, like her, were visibly skeptical. At exactly 2 p.m., Marcus and Deja arrived, walking side by side toward the podium. Their presence was commanding yet calm, their professionalism unmistakable. Marcus's tall frame and steady gaze projected authority, while Deja's confident posture and warm smile conveyed approachability. Deja was the first to speak. Thank you all for coming today, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. We wanted to take this opportunity to introduce ourselves and address some of the concerns that have been circulating. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. My name is Detective Deja Jackson, and this is my husband, Detective Marcus Jackson. We're both with the city's police department. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces registering surprise, others discomfort. We moved to Willow Creek because we saw it as a place where we could build a life together, Deja continued. We've spent our careers protecting communities just like this one, and it's important to us that this neighborhood feels safe for everyone." Marcus stepped forward, his deep voice commanding attention. "Unfortunately, it's clear that some residents don't feel the same way about us. We've experienced false complaints, unwarranted police visits, and thinly veiled hostility since the day we arrived." His eyes swept over the crowd, lingering briefly on Helen, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "We're here to tell you that this stops now. We're not asking for permission to live here, we're demanding the respect we've earned, just like every other homeowner in this community." The pavilion fell silent. Marcus's words hung in the air, heavy with a mixture of truth and defiance. Helen's face reddened as she avoided his gaze, while Pam and Tom exchanged uneasy glances. After the meeting, the Jacksons stayed behind to answer questions from those who approached them. To their surprise, several neighbors expressed regret for how they had been treated. A young couple, Rebecca and Jason, introduced themselves and apologized. "I think a lot of us let fear get the better of us," Rebecca admitted. "You've been nothing but gracious, and I'm sorry we didn't give you the welcome you deserved." Deja smiled warmly. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that." Not everyone was so receptive, however. Helen stormed out of the pavilion before the meeting ended, muttering about turning the neighborhood into a spectacle. Pam and Tom followed her reluctantly, their initial confidence shaken by the Jacksons' poised and professional demeanor. That evening, Marcus and Deja reflected on the day's events. Sitting on their porch with cups of tea, they watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. "Well," Deja said, breaking the silence, "we've made some progress." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, but it's just the beginning. Prejudice doesn't disappear overnight." Deja reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "No, it doesn't. But every step forward matters. And I'm proud of how we handled today." He smiled, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "Me too." As the couple sat together, a figure emerged from across the street. It was Rebecca, carrying a plate of cookies. She hesitated at the edge of their driveway before summoning the courage to approach. "Hi," she said timidly. "I thought maybe we could start over." Deja exchanged a glance with Marcus before smiling. "We'd like that." For the first time since moving in, the Jacksons felt a glimmer of hope that Willow Creek might become the home they had dreamed of. But they knew the road ahead would still be fraught with challenges, and they were ready to face them together. The days following the community meeting were a mixed bag of cautious acceptance and simmering resistance. While a few neighbors like Rebecca and Jason made genuine efforts to connect with the Jacksons, others, particularly Helen, dug in their heels. Helen had taken to venting her frustrations in the neighborhood group chat, although her once enthusiastic allies were now noticeably silent. One evening, as Marcus and Deja sat down to dinner, their doorbell rang. Marcus opened the door to find a frazzled-looking Tom standing on the porch, his face pale under the glow of the porch light. "Detective Jackson," Tom began, wringing his hands nervously. I need to talk to you." Marcus's instincts flared, but he nodded calmly. "Come in." Tom hesitated before stepping inside, his eyes darting around as though expecting Helen to pop out from the shadows. He sat on the edge of the couch, clutching his hat in his hands. "I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, "but I can't stay quiet anymore. Helen's been, well, she's been stirring the pot. She's obsessed with you too." Deja, who had been listening from the kitchen, joined them, her expression steady. "Obsessed how?" Tom sighed heavily. "She's been filing more complaints with the OAE, calling the police behind your backs, even spreading rumors about you both to anyone who'll listen. She's convinced herself you're here to disrupt the neighborhood." Marcus exchanged a glance with Deja. They had suspected Helen's hand in the ongoing harassment, but hearing it confirmed brought a new level of clarity. "Why are you telling us this now?" Marcus asked, his tone measured but firm. Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Because I think she's planning something bigger. I overheard her talking to Pam about organizing a petition to force you out." Deja folded her arms. "A petition? On what grounds?" "She doesn't need real grounds," Tom replied grimly. "She's just trying to make your lives miserable enough that you'll leave on your own." Marcus leaned back, his jaw tightening. Thank you for telling us. It's not easy standing up to someone like Helen. Tom nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry for letting it get this far. Deja offered a small smile. It's never too late to do the right thing, Tom. The next morning, Marcus and Deja took decisive action. They compiled every piece of evidence. They had gathered security footage of Helen lurking near their property, recordings of baseless police visits, and screenshots from the group chat. Armed with this information, they scheduled a meeting with the HOA leadership. The meeting, held in the association's modest office, was tense but productive. The HOA president, a pragmatic woman named Linda, was visibly disturbed as she reviewed the evidence. This is unacceptable, Linda said, shaking her head. The Neighborhood Watch program is meant to foster safety, not to harass residents. We couldn't agree more, Deja replied. All we're asking for is accountability and fair treatment. Linda promised swift action, including a formal warning to Helen and a reminder to all residents about the proper use of the Neighborhood Watch program. While it wasn't a perfect solution, it was a step in the right direction. That evening, Helen received a notice from the OA. The letter was firm, outlining her misuse of the Watch program and warning her that further violations could result in her removal from the committee. Helen read the letter with trembling hands, her face a mask of disbelief and indignation. This is outrageous, she fumed to Pam, who sat uncomfortably on Helen's couch. They're taking their side over mine. I've lived here for 20 years. Pam shifted uneasily. Maybe it's time to let it go, Helen. You've made your point. Helen glared at her, her eyes narrowing. Let it go? They're ruining this neighborhood. Pam didn't respond, her silence speaking volumes. For the first time, Helen felt the cracks in her influence widening, her allies retreating one by one. Across the street, Marcus and Deja were settling into a quieter routine. The days of police visits and whispered rumors were becoming a memory, replaced by moments of normalcy, chatting with Rebecca and Jason, greeting kids playing on the sidewalk, and finally feeling like part of the community. One afternoon, Deja stood in the backyard, admiring her newly planted garden beds. Marcus approached, wrapping an arm around her waist. Looks good, he said with a grin. You might actually have a green thumb. Deja laughed. Don't jinx it. I still have to keep them alive. Their light-hearted moment was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. They turned to see Rebecca walking up the driveway, holding a tray of cupcakes. Hey, Rebecca called, her smile warm. Thought you might want a little treat. Consider it a welcome to the neighborhood do-over. Deja smiled. Thanks, Rebecca. You didn't have to. Rebecca shrugged. It's the least I can do. I've been meaning to tell you my husband and I really admire how you've handled everything. You didn't just stand your ground, you made this place better. Marcus nodded. That means a lot. Thank you. As Rebecca left, Deja turned to Marcus, her smile soft but reflective. Maybe this place isn't so bad after all. Maybe not, Marcus agreed. But it's better because of us. Weeks later, Helen's influence in the neighborhood had waned significantly. Her attempts to rally the community against the Jacksons had backfired, leaving her increasingly isolated. She watched from her window as Marcus and Deja hosted a small barbecue in their backyard, neighbors laughing and chatting around the grill. For the first time, Helen felt like an outsider in the very neighborhood she had once ruled. She closed the curtains, retreating into her house. For Helen, the fight was over, but for the Jacksons, it was just the beginning of a brighter chapter. As the sun set over Willow Creek, Marcus and Deja stood side by side, watching the party wind down. Their journey to this moment had been anything but easy, but they had emerged stronger, their love and resilience shining brighter than ever. Deja raised her glass in a quiet toast. To new beginnings. Marcus clinked his glass against hers. And to never backing down. The couple smiled, their eyes reflecting the warm glow of the setting sun. Together, they had not only claimed their place in the neighborhood but had also left an indelible mark on it, a legacy of strength, unity, and quiet triumph.